But one of the themes of behavioral science is what people say influences them,
yes,
and what actually influences them. They are wildly different. Mm-hmm. And if you just directly question people, it will send you off in the wrong direction. What's much better to do is set up these simple test and control experiments, like the one I did with the black sheep vodka. And that gets you to the truth.
Welcome to On Top of PR with Jason Mudd.
Hello and welcome to On Top of PR. I'm your host, Jason Mudd with Axia Public Relations. Today I'm joined by Richard Shotton, and we're talking about hacking the human mind, the behavioral science behind 17 of the world's best brands. Richard is our guest today, and he is a behavioral scientist and founder of Astra 10. He's a best-selling author of 3 books, The Choice Factory, The Illusion of Choice, and his latest book, Hacking the Human Mind, which explores the behavioral science underpinning the success of 17 leading brands. Let's see. He specializes in applying behavioral science to marketing, helping brands like Google solve real-world challenges through consultancy, copywriting, and training. Richard, welcome to On Top of PR.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here too. Glad to talk about this interesting topic today with our audience. To that end, you and I were chatting before we hit record and already kind of identifying some of the very interesting ways that behavioral science impacts business, both with consumers and also with businesses in B2B environments. So let's start off, first of all, what was your inspiration to do this?
So for the book, I was intrigued by the fact that if you work in marketing, whether it's PR, creative, any of the disciplines, it's hard to get inspiration for the next campaign. And I think what people often fall back on is looking to a brilliant performing brand in their category or beyond. And it sounds like a simple thing to do, but actually, if you just copy a Nike or an Apple or an Amazon, it's very hard to copy the right thing because those brands do thousands of things every year. They're doing lots of things concurrently, some of which aid their success, some of which hinder their success. And so just blindly copying is not the right route. So what I did with Michael Aaron Flicker in this book, Hacking the Human Mind, is yes, we looked at 17 of the world's most successful brands and what tactics they used. But rather than talk about all the tactics, we whittled them down just to 1 or 2 by filtering them through a lens of behavioral science. So which of the tactics used by those brands have also been proven to work in robust, peer-reviewed, controlled experiments? And what it essentially does as a book is allows people to kind of identify the secret sauce, the magic ingredient that some of these amazing brands have used, and then take that underlying insight and idea and apply it to their own challenges. So that's the real purpose of the book.
That sounds awesome. I mean, something that would be right up my alley, something that I think I would really enjoy not only learning about, but, the study and the background, because, it's very true. I remember we had a client early in my agency and they were like, well, we don't want to talk too much about our story or give away too much of our secret sauce because we're afraid everybody would copy it. And, of course, I'm wanting to help them ultimately, but also, looking at it as like you're an important client of ours and we want to make sure you're successful. So I kept telling them like, imitation is the best form of flattery, but just because they understand some of your business model doesn't mean they're going to put you out of business.
Absolutely. It's the danger with an awful lot of books like, Good to Great, where they just summarize the behaviors of the high-performing companies. But of course, in a complex organization, not everything that a successful company does helps and contributes to that success. You've got to whittle down the tactics to a really small selection. So when we cover a brand like Amazon or Dyson or Guinness, in the book, we just look at 1 or 2 ideas from behavioral science and psychology that they use. So it's the underlying idea that can be applied elsewhere.
Nice. Well, I'm excited to dive more into that.
Yeah.
So you learned how 17 of the world's top brands use behavioral science to capture attention, shape perception, and influence decisions. First of all, how did you get access to this information?
Well, a lot of it is in the public domain. So, we've identified the brands from their market share data, stock performance. But then when we look at the evidence for their tactics, that's when we turn to psychology, either existing academic work or our own experimentation. Because sometimes the academics have run studies in frankly quite bizarre areas.
Yeah.
And in that circumstance, what they've proven is, may or may not work in the commercial world. What Michael and I did was then rerun some of those studies in a much more everyday setting to see that they'd work. So for example, there's an amazing set of studies called The Illusion of Effort. It's essentially the illusion of effort. Yeah. So it's the argument that if you have a product and people see that product, part of the audience's response will be due to the inherent quality of the product, but part of it will be due to the story of effort that goes around it. So if I believe that a lot of effort has gone into creating a meal or a wine or a PR consultancy project, if I believe lots of effort has gone into it, I will rate that product higher than if I believed little effort had gone into it. Mm-hmm. Now, the original work by academics was done by Andrea Morales, but it was done in, frankly, a little bit of a strange setting. So what we did for the book was do some very simple experiments to show it worked commercially. So we got 278 Americans. We showed them some imagery for a fake brand, Black Sheep Vodka. And some people were asked to rate the beauty of the vodka bottle. Okay. And others were told that the design's gone through 143 iterations. Now can you rate the beauty of it? And what we found was, even though everyone saw exactly the same visual stimulus, the people that had heard this tale of effort, they rated the beauty of the bottle 35% better than the group that hadn't heard that tale. So we did an awful lot of experimentation to try and show you can use some of these academic principles in the real world.
So it's more about the law or the story of the effort than it is necessarily the story of the brand itself. So meaning that if there's a story that showed no effort, but it was a unique and catchy story, is that as powerful as a story about the effort that went into it?
So the classic example of this in practice, this bias in practice, is Dyson. Dyson, an amazing brand. They've essentially created a luxury vacuum market from nowhere. And if you look at the PR, if you look at the advertising, if you look at their website, in fact, if you look at the very first line of the founder's biography, his autobiography, they're always communicating the same story. James Dyson went through 5,127 prototypes before he came up with the bagless vacuum.
Right, I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah. Now, logically, it's irrelevant how many prototypes he went through.
Right.
What should matter is it a beautiful looking piece of machinery? Does it pick up the dirt? But behavioral scientists aren't interested in what logically should affect people. They're interested in what actually affects consumers in practice. And what you can see is that the illusion of effort shows, by telling people this story of all the prototypes, all the work that's gone into the product, the consumer will rate exactly the same product that little bit better. So it's really about trying to create this story of effort that has gone into your product. It will change the influence on the consumer.
I'm really digging this, Richard. So it goes a little bit contrarian to what I would advise. I'm thinking of my own company, right?
Yeah.
So I would tell my own company, like, my team, I would be like, the client doesn't care that you spent X number of hours working on this and slaving over it, or, working hard on it, or whatever it might be. What the client cares about is, did you deliver what they wanted? And so I would be inclined to say, don't bother them, don't inconvenience them with the difficulty you had doing it. But I'm hearing maybe I'm off base here. If we're preparing and presenting a plan or a deliverable or a strategy or a campaign, maybe we should set the table, letting them know kind of the amount of energy, effort that went into it.
Yeah, and what you're describing, that approach you have, is completely logical. And if you go and survey your clients, they'll probably tell you that. They'll say, just get straight to the point. Yeah. I will very logically judge the merits of your work on what you put in front of me. I'm not influenced by these small factors. But one of the themes of behavioral science is what people say influences them, yes, and what actually influences them. They are wildly different. Mm-hmm. And if you just directly question people, it will send you off in the wrong direction. What's much better to do is set up these simple test and control experiments, like the one I did with the black sheep vodka. And that gets you to the truth. So I would argue, and don't push this too far, but if your team is putting together a proposal to client, and you've got an hour meeting, you might want to set up, maybe just 5 minutes to talk about some of the hurdles that you got through, some of the cul-de-sacs that you went down, talk about some of the refinements you made. And the end client won't know this is influencing them. But in life, so often, the more effort that goes into something, the better it is. People have got that as a rule of thumb in their head. And the interesting thing is that the rule of thumb takes on a life of its own. So even in situations where two different groups have shown the same product, if they think lots of effort's gone into it, they'll appreciate it more.
Yeah, I like that a lot. This is definitely kind of changing some of my thinking on it already. And immediately, I was talking to a colleague of mine over the weekend about working with clients and kind of perceptions and things like that. And, they mentioned, that clients are often interested in vanity PR, which means we want to be in the Wall Street Journal, we want to be in the New York Times, we want to be on CNBC. But if they're a B2C company, right, and they're doing business in a specific niche area, maybe they're B2B, but they're in a niche vertical, it really doesn't matter being kind of featured in general, well-known tier one media outlets, was his point. And being a good brainstormer, I said, yes. And, what we do at our company is we always subconsciously or unbeknownst to the client, we'll budget about 10% of the media relations outreach and the earned media coverage that we generate towards generating coverage in that client's backyard, even if they say they don't want local coverage, because we know that when the CEO is at a golf tournament, at dinner at the country club, at a fundraiser, walking the dog or whatever they do, a neighbor says, hey, I saw your company or I saw you featured in a local website or newspaper or magazine, they're going to get 10 times as many little anecdotal touches of people seeing that, or more than 10 times than if their company was in, the Wall Street Journal or New York Times kind of thing, because it's more local and there's a more local connection of that. So while millions of people consume the Wall Street Journal, the average person in your neighborhood, unless you are in New York City, doesn't really see it the same way, right? So it's funny that you mentioned, because I feel like there's some similarities between what you're saying and the conversation I was having this weekend.
Yeah. I mean, this is a long time ago for me now, but when I first started working marketing 25 years ago, one of the clients at the agency was a big music label, and the outdoor buyers, the people who were responsible for buying the posters, would always find out where the kind of star lived, the George Michael or the Adele, where they'd be staying in Britain when they came over, and then the route from the airport to their hotel or to their long-term accommodation was just lined with posters, so that the star was always kept completely happy. And it was a tiny proportion of the budget, but it kind of greased the wheels and smoothed everything over by keeping the kind of star's ego in check.
I like that. It's affirming to the client that, that you're doing the right thing, and you just happen to be very strategic around where you place it. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'd love to learn more about how we could apply these to our own campaigns.
Well, the brilliant thing is there are so many of these experiments. I would argue whatever brand someone works on, whatever category, whatever unique challenge they have, there's always going to be an experiment out there. So let's say you've got a pharma client or a pharmaceuticals or financial client.
Right.
Well, one of the things those industries are very bad at doing is speaking in an unnecessary complex way. Now, you often will see adverts or websites that have very dense copy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because those professionals think they work in a very serious business, therefore they need very professional sounding serious copy.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, behavioral science would suggest there's a bit of a mistake there. The complexity doesn't convey intelligence. It often conveys the opposite. So there's an amazingly titled paper from Daniel Oppenheimer at Princeton, and it's called Consequences of Erudite Vernacular, Utilized Irrespective of Necessity. And then there's a colon. And the final bit of the paper title is The Problem with Using Long Words Needlessly.
Okay.
And what Oppenheimer does in his study, I think it's 2006, it's around that era, gets a big group of people, and half of them are shown a bit of text. And it's an academic text. There's lots of complex, unnecessarily verbose words in there. That group rate the intelligence of the author. And then Oppenheimer goes and gets another group, shows them basically the same text, but he's replaced the unnecessarily complex words with simpler alternatives.
Okay.
Now, when the second group rate the intelligence of the author, they rate that author as being 13% more intelligent than the first group thought.
Mm.
Oppenheimer's argument is if you use complex terminology, you confuse the reader, and the reader doesn't blame themselves for that confusion, they blame the author. So if you want to convey strong brand values, the argument from Oppenheimer is speak in a simple, clear way. But if you think about the world of pharmaceuticals or the world of B2B or the world of finance, they almost do the exact opposite. They are laboring under this misassumption that they are conveying positive values by speaking in this complex way. What they should actually do is almost the complete opposite. So that is a very, very specific example, quite different from the illusion of effort, but one that an awful lot of industries could apply to great impact. Keep it simple.
I was just going to say that it's keeping it simple. I don't know if you have research to support this, but I've always heard about, the rule or power of threes. So you talk about things in threes. You have a list of threes. You give 3 recommendations. You have 3 product options, and that kind of thing. And the research I saw said that, 2 is good, 3 is great, 4 is okay. Any more or less is not good.
There is certainly the argument that each additional rationale you give for a product, you slightly undermine the core reason. And it's called the goal dilution effect. Zhang and Fishback? Yeah, Zhang and Fishback did the original study back in about 2007 when the University of Chicago. And for their study, what they did was recruit a group of people. And the first half of people saw an argument about why eating tomatoes was brilliant for preventing cancer.
Okay.
And then that group of people write down later how good they think tomatoes are for preventing cancer. Second group of people see exactly the same opening paragraph, all about tomatoes and cancer prevention. But beneath that paragraph, there is another paragraph saying tomatoes are also really good for preventing eye problems.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second group, when they are questioned how good a tomato is for preventing cancer, they come back with, I think it's a 7 or 8% lower score.
Mm.
What the psychologists argue is that when you start adding extra reasons to believe, you dilute the impact of your core rationale. Because generally in life, people have a rule of thumb that you can't be a jack of all trades, jack of all trades, master of none. We have this belief that if you specialize, you tend to be better at the underlying skill. So one of the mistakes many brands make is thinking that they just keep on telling people more and more reasons to believe it will lead to greater sales or greater success. But each extra argument slightly weakens the core one. So I think you're right. Maybe 3, maybe 4, but there is definitely a downside to adding on extra reasons to believe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the simplest answer is usually the best answer, right? And so in the human mind, they might be thinking that, the tomato example that you gave, right? If it's focused on one thing, it's clear, easy to digest. Suddenly there's more things to remember. So it deludes, I think, the positioning that you're describing, Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've got a point there of simplicity in number of messages, goal dilution and Zhang's work. And then you've got simplicity in language, which would be Oppenheimer. But you've also got arguments from people like Todd Rogers at Harvard about simplicity in terms of length of communication. Now, he makes a wonderful argument that if you ask someone for help or you ask them to change their behavior, it's hard for the audience to know the difficulty level of that request. And when people are uncertain or when a situation is unclear, they often look to proxy metrics. So Todd Rogers, his argument is that often people use complexity of message as a proxy for difficulty of the underlying task. So if I send you a 200-word email asking you to fill in a survey, according to Rogers, you'll think it's a 5 or 10 minute task. If I send you a 5-word email asking you to fill in a survey, you will assume it's a 1 or 2 minute task. We use length of request as a proxy for difficulty of completion.
That's very cool. I like that. So we've been talking about how small change in messaging can dramatically affect audience response. But we also want to cover about small changes in timing, and maybe we haven't covered this yet, but presentation, right, can affect audience response. So tell us more about that.
The timing one's a fascinating area. And one of the big principles of behavioral science is it's not just what you say, it's when you say it. So there are some really well-known studies about the fact that people are more open to change at the beginning of new time periods.
Like the new year?
Yeah, like the new year, but it could be the beginning of a week, after a birthday, the start of a month. So that's an idea.
Sort of milestone.
Yeah, exactly. That's called the fresh start effect. But I think the one that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because it's such a fascinating study, is by Adam Alter. So he's a brilliant professor at NYU. And he came up with this idea called 9 enders. So if you are 39, 49, 59, 29, 69, if your age ends in a 9, you are what Adam Alter would call a 9 ender. And Alter's argument is that people whose age ends in 9, they are massively more likely to make really big changes in their life. So if you want to get someone to do something radically different, like let's say you want them to save in a pension for the first time, or quit smoking, or start drinking non-alcoholic beers, Alt would say, don't target people randomly. Segment your message and reach those people whose age ends in 9. Now, at first, well, certainly my reaction when I first read that was I thought this is utter hokum. Why would that be the case? But Alter has a very strong logical argument. He says, look, it's not that being 29 or 39 is a magic number. He says, look, in American culture, British culture, European culture, we give disproportionate importance to the turn of a decade. Now, indisputably, turning 50 is a bigger deal than turning 51. And as you approach that landmark moment, for about a year beforehand, you start thinking about how well your life's going. And because you're thinking, you step off autopilot, and that's what makes you open for persuasion. That's the kind of rationale to Alter's argument. But one of the things I love about behavioral science is logic is never enough. You've got to prove these ideas experimentally. So what Alter does is looks at loads of different data sets. He looks at first-time marathon runners and shows that they are 48% more likely to run the marathon the first time when their age ends in 9. He looks at when men have affairs by looking at Ashley Madison data. And there's this 18% uplift in affairs when people's age ends in 9. Now, even unfortunately, in things like suicide, you see spikes in America when people's age ends in 9. So the argument here is if you ever need someone to make a really big change in their life, don't target them randomly. Use either your own internal data set or publicly available data sets that you can buy. Identify when someone's age ends in 9. And if you reach them, the same message will be much more powerful then than a different period.
That seems very logical, something I've never thought of before for sure. And I'm feeling a little bit like an underachiever because I'm 49 right now.
Yeah.
I'm going to be 50 by the time this episode airs. So now I'm thinking, gosh, because I've been thinking about, at least it's on my mind, right? I'm about to turn 50. Here's what I want to, have happen in my 50th year. So.
Yeah, exactly. And don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way trying to say everyone who's a 9-ender makes a massive change to their life.
Right.
Life's more complex than that. Of course it is.
Yeah.
But you are, you're more likely than other people. So if brands and businesses are thinking about where they should kind of allocate their money when they're communicating, this is a particularly predisposed audience. This is where you can get the biggest bang for your buck.
I like that a lot. And as I think about it too, since I'm about to be 50, I bet 12 months ago, I was probably more actively doing the things you're describing also, right? And now that it's been wrapping up that year, it's probably not as top of mind as now I'm about to officially hit the big 50.
That is a open question. So unfortunately, Alta doesn't splice 9-enders by month, so you can see when the effect is biggest.
That's for another study.
You've got to eke these studies out. You got to get a couple of books out. Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Audible. Enjoy 30 days free of Audible Premium Plus by going to ontopofpr.com/audible.
You're listening to On Top of PR with your host, Jason Mudd. Jason is a trusted advisor to some of America's most admired and fastest growing brands. He is the managing partner at Axia Public Relations, a PR agency that guides news, social, and web strategies for national companies. And now, back to the show.
Okay, so let's talk about a little bit more. I think this is important. We want to cover this point of discovering insights that travel across industries and offering ideas that you can borrow and adapt from.
Yes, so one of the chapters we have in the book is about Apple. It's an amazing brand, super successful, and they do so many behavioral science techniques. But probably the thing that they do very well that I think anyone could learn from is around their copywriting. So they are very good at applying the principle of concreteness. And what I mean by that is a concrete word in the kind of literature is a word that you can visualize. So if I say square door, that's a concrete word. If I say good value, that's an abstract word. You can't really picture what value looks like, whereas you can picture what a door looks like. And Apple are famously very, very good at using concrete words. So back when they launched the iPod, for example, everyone else in the category of MP3 players was talking about 50 megabytes of memory. Mm-hmm. Very abstract, impossible to visualize. Apple, on the other hand, talks about 1,000 songs in your pocket. And because you can picture a pocket, it's a much, much stickier message. Now, that might sound like a really tiny tweak in communications. But often with behavioral science, these small tweaks have huge effects. So there's an amazing study from 1972, a brilliant Canadian psychologist called Ian Begg. Really simple study, reads out to people a list of 22 word phrases. And after he reads it out, waits a little bit, and then asks people to recall as much as they can. Now, half of the words he read out were concrete words, like flaming forest or white horse. Half the words he read out were abstract words, like basic fact or subtle fault. And what Begg finds is that people remember 9% of the abstractions, but 36% of the concrete phrases. And that is a massive fourfold variance.
Right.
And his argument is essentially that vision's the most powerful of our senses. So if you as a communicator use language people can visualize, it's sticky, it's memorable. If you use language people can't visualize, it's completely forgettable. Now that is something that I think every communicator, whether you're a copywriter, whether you are in a presentation in a client meeting, whether you are sending an email, it is a really simple technique that has a massive impact on memory. So that would be one thing that you can take from Apple. And if you work as a soft drink, as a opticians, as a hearing aid, you can apply these principles, whatever category you're in.
Yeah, that is very cool. And just a good reminder, as always, we're in the business of PR, and I'm always trying to encourage clients to visualize their story, right? And if you can't provide a visual, not only does it attract less eyeballs, but it also creates less engagement.
Yeah, and a visual here could be, it could be actually a physical image, or when I think it comes to the words, it's words that the audience can easily imagine in their mind's eye.
Well, that's why a good journalist or storyteller is always talking about thinking in visuals, right? So thinking in visuals, having a visual, writing visually also helps. And that's one of my favorite things about radio, right? Radio, they call it the theater of the mind, right?
Yeah.
And great radio is somebody creating a visual and helping you plant a picture in your head visually that you're hearing audibly, right? And I think that's a very, very special talent that I wish I had in spades for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best radio writers use this again and again. But if you were just to pick up the paper randomly and read, through the editorial and the adverts, it's remarkable about how many people don't use this technique. They'll talk about being good quality or a trustworthy or premium. Now, they're all simple concepts that the audience can understand, but because the audience can't visualize them, as soon as they put the paper down, they'll have forgotten them 20 seconds later. So there's lots and lots of headroom for businesses to still apply this principle.
Yeah, I definitely can see that for sure. Tell me about how do you apply these tactics to make your brand the one that people reach for? So what is it that a company might need to do if they're listening to this podcast and they're saying, we need to do these kind of things at our organization? What tactics would you recommend they apply?
So I think a lot of the things we've talked about already are worthy of application. But if there was one thing to do, even if I didn't know what the challenge was, if I had to stake my life on making a recommendation without knowing what the unique challenge was, I would say to them, what you've got to do is make whatever you're trying to encourage, a behavior you're trying to get people to do, a product you're trying to sell, you need to give it the aura of popularity. Of all the principles that we discuss in the book, the one with the most evidence is social proof. It's the argument that humans are a herd species. We are deeply, deeply influenced by what we think others are doing. So if you can create this aura of popularity for your product, it will become more appealing and people are more likely to purchase it. They're more likely to want it. So I think if of all the principles we talk about, that is one of the most central.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting, and all of this has been fascinating to me. Tell us, Richard, what are you working on in this new year that's got you excited?
Do you know what? Probably the most exciting I've got this year and the end of last was around working with some food and drink companies. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole sub area of how do you make a product taste better without changing the formulation. So, there's some amazing work about packaging, that the heavier the package, the more premium people will find the product.
Sure. There's
some amazing work around how the sound of a bag being opened will change flavor perceptions, the colors that you use. I found that, very, very interesting. And there's some brilliant work by people like Charles Spence, who's probably the leading thinker in this area, that show the taste of a product is not just based on its chemical constituents, it's based on our expectations. If we think something's going to taste wonderful, then that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of his studies was done in, I think it was Edinburgh, a conference in Edinburgh, where they serve people the same food.
Okay.
But half of the conference attendees use very heavy cutlery when they're eating. Half of them use very light cutlery. Mm-hmm. Okay. And even though the food was the same, the taste ratings changed by the order of about 10%. People who were eating with heavy cutlery rated it as tastier and they were prepared to pay more for it. And Spence's argument is, over time, people learn that premium items tend to be heavy.
Yeah.
And it fuses this link in their minds that affects them even in situations where it's not appropriate. So this idea of cross-modal correspondence, I think is a wonderful one that far more brands can apply.
Yeah, I've seen that too when I've ordered something online and it arrives and the packaging feels flimsy or not very professional. It creates kind of a perception of the product quality, which I've seen both ways. I've seen a really good product arrive, I'll just call it practically naked, right? No real packaging, nothing meaningful. And I've had other products where it's like I'm opening it and it feels like something valuable. And then you get there and it's not very valuable. But at the end of the day, the packaging was really nice and it stood out to you, So I think this is very interesting. And who does this really well is AMC movie theaters, right? So
I don't know these. Yeah.
And you go to watch a movie, and as when the trailers or previews are playing, they play a commercial for their beverages, which is Coca-Cola, and you hear the fizzing, and you see the bubbles come up to the top of the cup, and they've got the 3D sound happening, and their popcorn is popping. And it just, the 3D effect of you hear the popcorn popping all around you. So you're making me think of that. And it's kind of like an immersive experience with just simply a drink of Coca-Cola being poured.
Yeah. And in these tactics, I think even though they don't affect the physical nature of the product, they're still just as valid. What matters is the perception of how nice a food is, not the reality of the actual content. So from a social good perspective, there's amazing opportunities for businesses to create a perception of sweetness without loading the product full of sugar, changing some of the color of the item people are eating, changing chocolate bars from angular edges to rounded ones has been shown to boost perceptions of sweetness. So you could change the formulation of your chocolate bar, remove sugar, probably save money by doing that, also save calories to attack the obesity problem, and there would be no loss of taste with some of these counterbalancing approaches.
Not to look at this from a micro view of the examples that you just gave, but from a macro view, what are some of the, and this may not be your area of expertise, and that's okay, but as I think through it, like what are the ethical ramifications of this type of activity also?
Oh, that's a great question. So my point on this would always be behavioral science is a neutral tool. It is, to take a completely different area, because it always makes it, I think, easier as a discussion point. Think about rhetoric. Rhetoric is a studied art form for 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks were writing about how to persuade, how to use rhetoric. Now, those tactics have been used in history by amazing people like Martin Luther King, getting people to love their neighbor. They've been used by the most dastardly dictators in the world. The same techniques were used to get people to hate their neighbor, to kill their neighbor. It's not the rhetorical technique that has a morality. It's the ends to which you put it. Right. Behavioral science is exactly the same. It is a neutral technique for becoming more persuasive. Unfortunately, it can be used for ill or it can be used for good. But the judgment of its ethical value is the ends to which it's put.
So somewhat like the saying, with great power comes great responsibility. Same thing with knowledge, right? You can have knowledge and you can use it for good, or you can use it to be manipulative, or use it for bad, or cause harm.
Completely. And just because these techniques exist doesn't mean it's something you should use on every different situation.
Sure.
There's an amazing American philosopher who's mentioned at the beginning of Richard Thaler's book called John Rawls. And he talks about the publicity principle. And his guidance is, if the behavior you were undertaking was kind of splash on the front page of your local newspaper, would you feel ashamed? And that, to me, is a pretty good guide to whether the intervention you're suggesting is ethical or not. If people knew you were doing it, would you feel ashamed? If so, consider very, very deeply whether you should still continue.
I've heard that one. I've also heard the one of, would you be proud of your grandmother to know it? Would you be proud of your children to know it? Would you be proud if the public knew about it after you passed away?
Yes, for me, so it's a nice symmetry here. So the first principle we talked about was the illusion of effort. This idea that the same product can be valued differently depending on the story of effort around it. So my gran, she was married obviously to my grandfather, He was a kind of mechanic engineer, had a little small shop. And by all accounts, he was a brilliant engineer, but a not so brilliant businessman. And the company did quite well. But he would, a car would come into his shop. He would repair it really quickly, then give the customer a bill straight away. And often they would be angry and think, how can you charge me 50 quid when it only took you, a few hours to repair this car? Right. He was a heavy drinker, smoker, died quite early. And my gran took over the business. Never fixed a car in her life and no idea about mechanics, but was a very, very canny businesswoman. And the only change she said to the mechanics was, look, if you fix it in an hour, just hold on to it for a little bit and bring them up at the end of the day.
Yes.
And when, people were getting the call at the end of the day saying their car was ready, they were completely happy paying the bill. Yeah. So when you say, would my gran be happy with the applications of these principles? Right. That's a more gray area in my particular situation. Yeah.
Well, Richard, I've enjoyed this conversation. And wrapping up, if somebody is really interested in this topic and behavioral science, is there a resource you would point them to that you would recommend that keeps them up to date on the latest studies and research, that they can consume as a layman like myself, maybe in little, bits and bytes?
So if it's bits and bytes they want, I do a newsletter. So if people contact me on LinkedIn, Richard Shotton, I'll send them a link to that. It's completely free, but each kind of couple of weeks we'll digest a research paper and tell people the marketing applications.
Okay.
Or the other one's the books. Hacking the Human Mind is a great one.
I was going to get to the book.
Yeah. Okay. I jumped in too early.
But no, that's good. And so what is the best way for them to reach you if they're interested in, one, connecting with you because they liked what they heard here in this episode, they've read your book, or they want to get the newsletter? Yeah,
drop me a DM on LinkedIn. That's probably the best thing. Yeah. Oh, no, on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Okay, LinkedIn. And then your book. So if someone's interested in getting your newest book or your two previous books, what's the best way for them to find it? Is it on Amazon?
Yeah, Amazon's it tends to be the cheapest one. I mean, certainly in Britain, it's in all the bookshops, the Waterstones and the Deborah H. Smiths, but yeah, it's certainly in Amazon in America as well.
Okay. Well, Richard, I really appreciate it. This was very helpful, and I'm going to wrap us up here. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jason.
Yeah. So this has been another episode of On Top of PR. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the honor and privilege to help you stay on top of PR. If you found this episode helpful, please take a moment to share it with a friend or colleague who would benefit from it. And if you haven't yet, do us a favor and drop us a review in the platform that you're currently consuming this. We would really appreciate it. It'll help other people discover On Top of PR. And as we said earlier about the level of effort or the story of effort, we put a lot of work into this show. And it would be really helpful if you'd spend a moment to tell others about it. We would really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
This has been On Top of PR with Jason Mudd, presented by ReviewMaxer. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and check out past shows at ontopofpr.com.